Okay, I think we have gone live now. And so I want to thank everybody who is participating and people who are watching this conversation about what kinds of housing can help reduce homelessness in our community, which will hopefully provide some information about what's happening with homelessness right now, what the trends were before the pandemic. And last week we had a conversation with some elected officials about the possibility of using bonding and government-owned properties to get more, to help people get into housing, or to create new housing that's needed to help reduce homelessness. And so this week we're talking about what kinds of housing could help with that. This isn't about prioritizing which kind of housing is needed the most. It's more about talking about the range of what's needed. And so we have people with very different backgrounds. Before we have any of them talk, I should first off take a step back and say that this is a series of Crossroads Urban Center has been working with low-income people, with our food pantry and thrift store since 1966 in one form or another. We have always combined the direct services we provide through our thrift store and food pantry with advocacy on issues that cause people to need help, hoping that less people would need help with clothing, need help with food, need help with bus passes and the other things that we help with if they could afford to pay the rent, or if they had higher paying jobs, or whatever other needs they need met. We historically have had a poverty summit in the month of August, but obviously, you can't get 100 people together and talk about hunger and homelessness this year. So we decided instead to organize a series of panels, and this is the second one. Next week, we'll actually be talking to the Republican candidate for county mayor, Trent Staggs, who's we're working on setting up a similar conversation with his opponent, Mayor Jenny Wilson. But if you have a question you'd like to ask one of the panelists, you can type it in on the Facebook Live feed for this. If we aren't able to get to your question, we will ask it later. Sort of to set things up, I just wanted to first off mention that, or talk about why we wanted to organize this. And I think it's useful because not everybody is as close to homelessness as we are here at Crossroads. About half the people we serve at our food pantry were homeless before the pandemic began, and that percentage has gone up since it has begun. And so we spend a lot of time talking to homeless people, have seen how different programs impact homelessness. I was thinking the other day about how when I started working at Crossroads in 2001, there was a group of about 20 guys who I would see every single day. They would come in to get some water and use the bathroom first thing in the morning. And we'd see them at different points in the day. And if one of them disappeared, I later came to learn if they stopped coming in, it often meant that they had passed away. And then in 2004, 2005, folks in the state and county level started talking about working on a 10-year plan to reduce chronic homelessness. And during the next 4 or 5 years, we built some permanent supportive housing units. And what was really interesting is that I stopped seeing more and more of those people because they actually moved into housing. And so people who, when I met them and first, when I first started seeing them every day, if you ask them why they're homeless, the biggest answer they would give is because that's where they wanted to be. They liked being on the streets. But these people who we would now call shelter resistant, when they were given the opportunity to move into housing, they did. And so I think it's worth, when people like me say we believe in housing first, it's because we've seen it work. I think, and some of our panelists have the same experience, I think that the other reason we're doing this is because we saw how the progress we were making on moving toward a housing first model in 2005, 2006, 2007, ended in 2009. when we had the Great Recession, and we actually stopped building supportive housing for almost 10 years. And so I think we thought, last week we had a panel where we talked with some elected officials about what could be done to build housing that's needed during this pandemic and or during this recession caused by the pandemic. And I think so that we don't pause on progress in addressing homelessness. And we invited some people who have a great deal of expertise from different perspectives to talk about what kind of housing is needed. Our first panelist is Sahil Oberoi, who works for Utah Community Action, which does some amazing work in terms of helping people avoid homelessness. They divert people from the shelter. They are actually administering our county's pandemic rental assistance program. They do mediation, and so I thought we would invite him to come and talk about sort of where things are at in terms of people who is needing help in terms of avoiding homelessness. So I'll turn it over to Sahil.
Thanks, Will, for the introduction. I'll try to be brief because I know that we have a lot of really good people on here. Zach and Michelle, I'm sure all three of us could probably talk about housing for a couple of hours, more people. But as far as UCEA is concerned, our scope of homeless prevention is multifaceted. As you mentioned, we provide diversion services at all of the homeless resource centers, the weekend day center, as well as the family shelter. For those watching that aren't familiar with diversion, basically what it is having a creative conversation with individuals as they are coming into shelter to see if there are alternatives to shelter. There are a lot of benefits to this. The first one, of course, is freeing up shelter beds. This is huge. We're obviously facing a bed shortage in DHRCs. The second is to try to insulate folks from experiencing trauma as they go into the homeless system. There have been a lot of studies done that speak to, once you get into the homeless cycle, it's harder and harder to get out. And unfortunately, what we have been seeing is a lot of folks that are new to homelessness over the past couple of months due to COVID. We're seeing folks that are accessing the system that never have, but it's unfortunate. There are less jobs. The lack of ability to pay rent is something that's really daunting right now. So along with that, what we also offer are mediation services. So we have a mediator that works at the courts, as well as folks can call in and to see what we can do to navigate that relationship between landlord and clients. So there are two core components of the mediation service. The first is like I mentioned, mediation, working with the landlord and tenant to see if we can come up with an agreement that works for all parties. And then the second is to educate tenants on what their rights are. Especially right now, we're seeing that tenants sometimes are choosing to self-evict when they don't necessarily need to. You have a 3-day pay or vacate. Usually the eviction process takes close to 20 business days. So we try to educate clients, let them know that, once you get that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get out within 3 days. There is going to be a procedure for that to happen. And we try to educate them and tell them, work with your landlord first off. That's the most important thing, is to have that conversation, let the landlord know where you're at. If they provide a 3-day pay or vacate, that's a procedural step. They're by law required to do that if they want to start the eviction process. So we have a lot of landlords that say to us, we are just doing this because if we can't work something out, we need to have a backup. But for us, it means we try to educate clients to say that should mean that you need to go talk to your landlord and let them know where you are. A lot of the housing companies or the housing options right now are managed by property managers. So it's not necessarily you're just talking to one family landlord. So it's talking to the property manager and letting them know that this is the crisis you're facing. And then through that, what we are fortunate to have is a case management team that is able to provide emergency rental assistance. Bill had mentioned that we have COVID funding, which we were fortunate to get from the state, city, and county. So far with the COVID funding, we've been able to assist over 160 families, comprised of over 800 individuals. So it's something that's out there, and I encourage anyone that needs COVID help or needs rental assistance to call into our number, 801-359-2444. We have COVID funding, and we also have other types of funding as well to assist with individuals, I think the focus for Utah Community Action is to really engage in homeless prevention, try to figure out what we can do to assist people from becoming homeless. And then I think the biggest gap right now in the system is probably rapid rehousing assistance. We have rapid rehousing. Basically, rapid rehousing is for individuals that are homeless and need rent and deposit and rent to get back into a stable unit. So there are, a whole host of challenges. First off, when you get to that level, right? The biggest is probably eviction. Like if you have an eviction on your record, it makes it very difficult to find a place, A, and B, even if you do find a place, the deposits we're seeing are sometimes 2x, 3x for a normal deposit. So, for us, what we try to focus on is, even if we are unsuccessful with mediation in terms of retention, we're really trying to make sure that there is some kind of compromise made with the landlord where there's not a eviction on the person's record. We're trying to make this, if you do fall in and you do lose your housing unit, we want it to be as quick as possible for us to assist. So that's one of the goals that we try to strive for with our mediation, is to ensure that there isn't an eviction on an individual's record. It'll allow them to get back into a unit quicker. And a lot of this is just education, right? I think tenants sometimes don't realize the rights they have. So they try to find other remedies through the system. But like I said, for us, our goal is to provide emergency rental assistance to make sure that there isn't an eviction on someone's records. I mean, mutual termination is a really good way to kind of sidestep the eviction process, right? So it'll be that the person, the tenant won't have a stable housing unit. We get that. That's a huge problem, and we can get into what we're seeing in terms of rents. But if they don't have an eviction on their record, it's going to be a lot easier to get them into a unit. Now, just kind of pivoting to what we're seeing in terms of housing shortages, right? So we're seeing a lot of interesting things. We're of course seeing that rents are absurdly high. Sometimes we get clients that are paying 60, 70, up to 80% of their income to rent. And I personally don't understand how people are able to do that, make ends meet. It's ridiculous. But the other thing that we are seeing is this concept of termination of leases. So if you have a lease with a tenant, we're seeing sometimes what happens is when you have a lease, it's a 1-year lease. And then when the lease term ends, you fall into a month-to-month lease. So we're seeing a lot of month-to-month leases, which are kind of scary to think about, because what that does is it can put you at the whim of a landlord in terms of terminating a lease. I mean, it can be advantageous in some scenarios, but it could be disadvantageous in other scenarios. For example, if a landlord wants to renovate their place, they can go through the lease term. It's not an eviction because you were on a 30-day lease. So we're noticing a lot more of those recently, which has been interesting. But I mean, it all goes to just the concept of affordable housing. The difficulty we're seeing is those units that were affordable are being repurposed and redesigned or remodeled so people can charge higher. I mean, it's I get it from a landlord's perspective. If you can yield more, you probably would want to. But it's getting scary out there. I think I've probably spoken for too long, Bill. Are there any questions or yeah?
So if there were more, would you see less people coming in if more people could find a place that they could afford to rent for just half their income instead of 60 or 70%?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's legislation I know in big markets, New York, California, that's trying to tie rent to a person's income, which, 30% of income. So it can maintain, so folks can maintain, a good livelihood as well as pay for rent. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Our next panelist is Bale from Housing Connect, which is the Salt Lake County Housing Authority. I he's agreed to come and talk to us about the fact that we actually were in a housing crisis before the pandemic even began. And so there were already people paying more for rent than they could afford. And I mean, the housing authority has vouchers for people, but there are some of those people, even with a voucher, had trouble finding a place that they could afford to rent. And so I was hoping he could talk to us about the struggles people are having just finding a place that they can afford to rent right now, and maybe some of the gaps that have been that they see in the existing housing stocks, where if the city, county, or state were to invest, we could help make it easier to keep people in homes.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned kind of the state of things prior to COVID, and they've seemingly really been exacerbated even more, both our kind of economic landscape. We have many more households that don't have the income that they once had, that even probably wasn't adequate to pay for rent and all the other costs of living. I'll talk about it kind of as a bit of a three-legged stool as it relates to certainly the landscape of homelessness. So, physical units, subsidy that makes, the mechanisms that make units affordable, and then services, and touch on that just lightly. Each of those components are pretty critical, and it seems over the years, at least one of them has been kind of our headwind that's limited us to getting folks into housing. At times it may be a shortage of subsidy. At other times, certainly physical units has been a substantial thing. And looking at all the reports of how many just our raw housing stock, we need thousands, tens of thousands of more units to support both the growing population and folks that have been doubled up all throughout for the past years. And then services. Many of the households that we move into housing need some additional support to make that transition go well and to anchor housing. So maybe one on the front end is just the housing is an incredibly complex landscape. It's really simple if one earns enough money and you can go find a place to rent and afford it. But when you fall in kind of that other category of maybe not having enough income, it's not all that easy to figure out how to get assistance. There's a number of different types of assistance. And I think one thing that we've done exceptionally well as a community in the last years is help make that easier, make the front door smoother, remove some of kind of it's not quite secret handshake, but if you get connected with the right person, then you find kind of connection to assistance. So subsidy, we have a number of different ways that we help households. Our largest program, our Housing Choice Voucher Program, funded by the federal government, Section 8, known as Section 8, is kind of a primary tool. Then specifically to the kind of populations experiencing homelessness, there's some additional federal monies called Continuum of Care, was Shelter Plus Care, that really links rental subsidy with supportive services. And to highlight just a little bit of the complexity, there's different parts to each. So on Section 8, one is income qualified. So you have to make under a certain amount of income. And then that can support rent, but it doesn't pay any of the upfront costs in terms of app fees, deposits. And that tends to be one of the challenges our households encounter is, if we look at our demographic of folks on that program, the average income is just over $13,000 across the population. And to come up with, what Sahil mentioned, what now might be a double or triple deposit, come up with $1,000 or higher than that, it's a lot of money to find. And many of our households may get to the point where they are eligible for housing assistance, and that's one of their hurdles. And we've found ways to solve some of that, but it continues to be a bit of a barrier. There's a lot of great entities and funders in the community that have helped fill some of those gaps. Then, the Continuum of Care program that supports a lot of our households exiting homelessness, it can cover deposit. in the way that ours are structured, it can't cover app fees. And so we've also had to find kind of that gap. And if we look at that cohort, the average income is just under $7,000. So about half of what we see on our Section 8 program. So households are making $6,000 a year. And so it really is the case that, come up with $100 to go apply to 2 or 3 different apartments, not knowing whether you're going to get accepted, is a whole bunch of money that might not feel it to some of the rest of us in our community. But that can be a pretty substantial hurdle. One of the other tools that was mentioned is when we get fully engaged in housing. So we're an active developer. We have a number of permanent supportive housing properties, and that's where we've leveraged some of our rental assistance. Also, the property manager, and also in many cases are the service provider, and that solves a number of the other barriers that we see. So screening criteria that was mentioned, that most certainly comes up. We have households that maybe have not had a successful experience previously in housing, whether they've been evicted or have other criminal background issues that come up. And in much of our housing stock in the community, those are reasons why folks get screened out. And I think how we solve that as a community is we have a broad spectrum of housing options. And if we have enough, there's a place for everyone. There's some housing that's exceptionally low barrier that in this case comes with some additional services that really ensure that those households can thrive in housing. So the screening criteria can be a little bit looser and a little bit more accepting and supportive of folks that need another go at making sure that they can exit homelessness into housing. So that's a critical piece. You're right in that we had a really great push to develop a number of proper projects. And I think we're seeing a bit of a resurgence. I think Shawn and Michelle will speak to that, but in quantity is probably on the front end of how many we need. We need more of that, that housing. So let's see. So then, just speak a little bit to the community coordination. I think that's one of the areas where we've really thrived as a community, is making sure we have a central front door. It addresses a lot of the complexity of, many of our housing resources are targeted. We have programs that support individuals that have HIV and AIDS. We have folks that are connected with behavioral health treatment. We have programs for folks who are transitioning out of care facilities, but it's difficult to know all of those, where they exist and do you qualify for which one. So having coordinated central triage has been a really key component, having a coordinated entry system. And it's both how folks get into shelter, but equally important, how we help households into housing. So there's been a lot of effort there that I think has really made it easier for households to know what's available. Not to say that there aren't barriers, but I think that's been a critical component that a lot of work has gone into over the last couple of years. Just a quick kind of last one, supportive services. We see that at the moment as one of the kind of barriers to housing. So we have some additional housing resources that we could make available to households, but there isn't adequate case management in the community. And it's really in 2 ways. Some of our sources require it in the sense that as a recipient of funding, that we need to make sure that households are receiving supportive services. It's voluntary to the households, but to us, we know that it's a critical component, that it comes with that. If we're going to move someone in that needs that, we need that as a critical ingredient. We see Medicaid as one of the potential paths to that. There's some kind of nuts to crack on making that available, but that's one of the currents. So at the moment, we actually probably are experiencing all 3 legs of the stool as the barrier. We need more physical units. We need more subsidy. I guess one really kind of great thing there is we've seen everybody get involved. So federal government has been, we'd love for those pots of money to grow, but the county has been significantly involved in finding new ways to support housing assistance. Salt Lake City has really joined in helping find funding. And there's been ongoing communication with the state around how the state can be involved in terms of kind of rental assistance and other costs.
So there's a shortage of physical units. If the city, the county, and the state each came up with 2 properties that they were going to devote to the development of targeted housing, we could help them figure out some projects that are needed.
Absolutely. I think just a couple quick points on that. So subsidy is a critical element. One of the most common used tools is project basing Section 8 funding. So those are most commonly held by housing authorities. And what we see as an agency is there's a vast need across so many different populations, and this one being a critical one, meaning folks that are experiencing homelessness in that pipeline. But we also, as a housing authority, see that it's not just that group. And so the difficulty there is making the balance around how we utilize that limited resource that's not growing. But that is a critical component. That could be a place where the state could get involved in growing that pot of money. The other piece on development is, the common things we'd want is make sure that we site properties well. We want to make sure that the households live in a community that has access to what they need. So it's close to a grocery store, and it has safe access to schools, and that it's in a place that one would want to live. And sometimes that can be a challenging conversation. Each of us that have worked on siting properties, those are always an adventure. But I think the flip side of that is these are people who need housing. And as a community, we should try to do it as best we can in design, in location, in accessibility. What we know, the origin of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is if we have choice where we can live, and based on where one lives, things go different. They go better when one has access to opportunity. And so that would be, I guess, the one other pitch that I would have is that is a critical component as we think through new projects. And to make sure that the communities that they land in, that they graciously accept them as an added benefit to their community.
Okay, thanks. That was really helpful, I think. Our next panelist is Shawn McMillen, who from First Step House. They, I think, the reason we asked them to be part of this panel is that I think oftentimes when we talk about what causes people to be homeless, people talk about mental illness, they talk about addiction, but they don't necessarily talk about the specific needs of people who are coming out of treatment. With Medicaid expansion, there are more people who can afford treatment, but being released from treatment to the street, just like being released from the state mental hospital to the street, or being released from the hospital to the street, or being released from the jail to the street. I mean, there are lots of people who end up being homeless from some sort of institutional setting. And I think Shawn, they're doing some amazing work to provide housing for people coming out of treatment. And actually, I was going to start talking about what they do, but I'll let Shawn talk about that because I'll probably get something wrong. Thank you for being available.
And thank you, Bill, for inviting me to be part of this panel. These are folks on this panel of folks I work with sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, and love working with them and learn a lot. They know things about this housing world that I just do not. And the joke that I share is some of the people on this call have forgotten more than I know about housing. Thank you. You raise a really important point, Bill. I mean, since the COVID-19 about substance use disorder, mental health conditions complicating an individual's path out of homelessness. A piece of information, we've seen a 40% spike in opiate overdoses since the COVID-19 crisis emerged. And we had started to see over the last year that trend line moving down, so that was a good thing, but we've lost momentum. you know, and unfortunately, because of COVID-19, people aren't accessing treatment at the same levels that they were before, because unfortunately, in so many ways, the criminal justice system is the most important referral source for substance use disorder treatment and mental health treatment in the nation. Now, that's wrong, but it's just the facts. And when I say it's wrong, that the criminal justice system is the largest provider of behavioral health treatment services in our country. That's just wrong. But they've also become a good partner because they recognize that they're not a mental health system, they're a public safety system, and that the people who are occupying jail bed days are individuals that actually need to be in behavioral health services in one setting or another in the communities that they come from. So that said, First Step House, we were founded in 1958, and as a true halfway house. So for individuals actually exiting the Salt Lake County Jail. We've since evolved into a co-occurring capable behavioral health services provider that includes residential treatment, outpatient treatment, recovery support services. We've been in the transitional housing business since the 80s. And just recently, we've moved or included our mission scope to include permanent supportive housing with our new Central City Apartments complex at 434 South, 500 East. So this housing thing is something that we've known about as a behavioral services provider for a long time. And in fact, 60% of the individuals that come to our door are individuals who are unstably housed. And what I mean by that is that they either meet criteria for homelessness, and about 20% of them meet criteria for chronically homeless. Another percentage are persistently homeless, or there are individuals who are exiting jails and institutions. So jails, the Salt Lake County Jail, the Utah State Prison, or one of the psychiatric hospitals in the county or in the state. So when I say we developed transitional housing back in the early 80s, what I'm talking about is a model of recovery housing. And your panelist, Shireen Gorbani, council member Gorbani, mentioned this during our call your call a couple of weeks ago. And what we've come to discover, as Derek Kitchen mentioned in that same call, is that actually recovery support services that include housing is healthcare. So we have primary treatment, and then we have, and that's that residential intensive care. Then we have outpatient services where people have to transition to housing in the community in some version. And then those ongoing recovery support services. And there's some researchers in the SUD treatment world who have pegged the number at 60 months. If we're able to stay linked to someone who has in the past struggled with a substance use disorder for 60 months, the likelihood that they will remain stable for the balance of their life, and this goes to a study that looked at a group over 48 years, that they will remain stable for the balance of their life at a rate of 85%. That's a big number. 85%. If we can stay linked for 60 months, that doesn't mean they're in treatment, that they're receiving an intensive dose of services, just that they're staying linked to helping professionals in some way. And the reason that that's so important is that so many of the people that we are serving in our settings are individuals who have really poor social networks. Really, really poor social networks. They don't have family members who are willing to remain engaged for a multitude of reasons, or the friends that they do have, the social network that they do have is maybe not the best, and they lack resources to help the individual, like a car to help them get to a medical appointment. When they discover 9 months down the road that they've got diabetes and they've got to initiate treatment for that. Those are all really big deals. Well, recovery housing emerged as a model that we've come to understand. If you can keep an individual engaged in recovery housing for 9 months. And that's a pretty service-rich environment. What I mean by service-rich is that they've got contact with a helping professional on a daily basis, but they're living and working in the community, but in a group setting. So they've got that social network around them of other individuals who are living in that house with them. In the case of First Step House, it is a set of fourplexes and duplexes that work incredibly well to provide that support, make sure that those links are maintained to helping professionals, but they're living fully in the community. They're doing the things that all of us do, but they've got a safe, supportive environment to return to in the evening or when they're not working. And if we can keep those folks linked to us for 9 months, the likelihood that they will be doing well at 24 months. So 9 months, you look at them at 24 months, about 65% of that group is still doing incredibly well. Now, stable, working, now at 9 months, at 24 months, now living independently in market housing. That's good stuff. That's a really good stuff. Another thing that is really critical here, and everybody sort of touched on it, and that's the hurdle that criminal history and past eviction create for entering housing in the community. We serve a lot of folks who exit jail and prison, and an individual has got to provide some background information to a landlord. And as soon as they see, yeah, I was in jail or I was in prison, or yeah, I have a felony, they go to the bottom of the list. And when you've got a vacancy rate between 2.5 and 6%, over the last number of years, those folks don't get chosen for the quality apartment complexes. They just don't get chosen. That goes to someone else who doesn't have that kind of history. Nevertheless, because of great partnerships with the Housing Authority of the county and the Housing Authority of the city, the Road Home, we've been able to find niches of landlords that are felon friendly, that will house these folks. But despite building out that network, we've still got individuals who are occupying residential treatment beds for longer than is clinically necessary, and there are people waiting to get in. They're waiting to get into treatment. So housing is healthcare. Reentry housing is important. These are both transitional housing models, as well as recovery housing. But we also see a significant number of individuals who require permanent supportive housing, or PSH. And we as a behavioral health services provider have moved into that space to meet the needs of the community, but also the needs of the individuals that we've served at different times at First Step House. And what we know about that population is that they do incredibly well when they're linked to our services, but as soon as we transition them to an independent living situation, they get isolated, they start drinking and using again, or the complicating symptoms of their underlying mental health condition reemerge, and after a relatively short period of time, they destabilize, or they're so unstable that the landlord is having problems, and they end up getting evicted. And then within 12 to 24 months, they're back at my front door. So we've moved into this permanent supportive housing space to circumvent that, to intervene on that. Let's keep them in proximity to services, light touch most of the time, more intensive touch when necessary, but live full and complete lives in the community, and wrap services around them as is necessary. That's all I got. Thanks.
That was really great. Thanks, Shawn. Our last panelist is Michelle Flynn. I think it looks like we might go a little beyond 11:45. Hopefully that's okay. I think it's just as I think about this, I find myself thinking, why I first wanted to get into this work, because I think for a lot of us, I mean, you get interested in working to help reduce homelessness because you see that there is like that having the homeless levels that we do is a justice, it's a fairness concern. I think when you look at national statistics on homelessness, African Americans make up 13% of the country's population, but over half of the people in families with kids who are homeless are African Americans. And here in Salt Lake County, African Americans make up 1% of the county population, but they make up 6% of the county's homeless population. And so I think we have a safety net that people fall through, and disproportionately the people who follow through are people of color. And for me, that's sort of, I mean, when you see that, you realize, I mean, if you have a safety net that's broken in a way that systematically hurts one group of people, you know, it makes you wonder why do we have a safety net that anybody falls through? Why does anybody become homeless? And I think for us, I mean, we organized a series of panels because we don't want this recession to lead to another 10-year period where we fall behind on addressing homelessness. So our last panelist is Michelle Flynn, who's with the Road Home and has been there as they've done some really great work in terms of expanding the housing stock available for reducing homelessness. And I just was hoping she could share her perspective on what kinds of housing, if the city and the county and the state were to find creative ways to spur the development of new types of housing, what she'd like to see them focus on. So thank you for taking time to be part of this, Michelle.
Thanks, Bill. It's an honor to be here with my friends and expert panelists. Following up on them, I might just shorten a little bit, plus we're a little short on time. But I just want to add on to what you said. It's not right and it's not okay to have the level of homelessness that we have in this country. It doesn't need to be this way, and it wasn't always this way. And lack of investment in truly affordable housing is the main reason why we have so many people experiencing homelessness that we do not need to have in this country. So let's take this opportunity. Let's use this pandemic of COVID-19, this crisis that we're facing, that's a health crisis. As many of you have said, housing is healthcare. Let's take this opportunity to really shift our homeless response system to focus on the kinds of housing that we need and reduce the number of people that we have in our shelters and out on our streets. At the Road Home, we operate 2 homeless resource center shelters. Last year, we had over 8,000 different people come through a shelter. That's not okay, and we can do better. We have an aging population. More and more people who are older are becoming homeless. We have a population that has higher health conditions, a higher level of high risk. And those are all things that lead to the spread of COVID-19 and higher deaths and costs to our healthcare system. We're doing a lot to mitigate that within the homelessness system. But let's talk about some opportunities to really shift what we're doing, building on all the work that the gentlemen before me have talked about with preventing and diverting and having specialized housing programs. We can really focus on some of the things that we are doing now during COVID. For example, with the help of Salt Lake County, we're operating a hotel program that diverts people who are older and at high risk, so they don't ever have to come into shelters. They can stay in a hotel in a more social distance kind of setting. Let's make sure that the folks that are in that hotel go into housing from there and don't come back into the homelessness system. Maybe we can convert that hotel or other hotels to small apartments, to longer term old single room occupancy type of units, which is much needed for the single adults who are experiencing homelessness. For our families, what we're seeing is a need for more permanent supportive housing. That's been touched upon. We definitely need more. A lot of our families who experience homelessness are young. They do not have a support system around them. They need those supportive services and need them for an extended period of time. There's always very, very few permanent supportive housing units available for families compared to the need out there. But we also need, as was mentioned, just deeply affordable housing. Many of our families get connected with employment. The kids get a little bit older. They're more able to take care of themselves. And those families might not need permanent supportive housing any longer. As Shawn was saying about residential treatment, we see the same thing in families that are in permanent supportive housing. They're staying there because they can afford the rent there, and they can't afford the rent anywhere else in the community. Just through our agency alone and the programs we operate in rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of money that we are providing towards rental assistance over the last 2 years. Over $150 to $200 more per month for rents that we're paying now than we were back in 2019. And that reduces how far we can spread our rental assistance dollars, and then we can, fewer families that we're able to serve. I just want to touch on rapid rehousing. Sahil mentioned it. It's our key really to ending homelessness and challenge. We're challenged not, similarly to as we are with the three-legged stool of not necessarily having all the supports needed to run a really effective rapid rehousing program. It has 3 components, and one is housing identification. We need the units. We need to preserve affordable units that are out there, and we need more affordable units, and we need to be able to find those units and connect families to units where they are approved and can quickly access them. And then that rent and move-in assistance, really making sure that we can help pay those double deposits or triple deposits and initial rent, so individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness can get back on their feet, and provide that in a really tailored way for each individual and family, so that the rent that they have really works for them. And that, location is important, and having some choice around affordable units is important. And there's very, very little of that. When we find an affordable unit, it's probably the only one that's available for quite some time for a particular family. If it's not near a place they're working or near school or childcare, then we run into transportation issues, and affordable transportation is daycare and transportation are the 2 greatest needs we hear from our families all the time. And then the third real strong component of rapid rehousing is the case management and supportive services. And we have to be able to provide that kind of support to our families as they move into an affordable unit, to make sure that they know and can navigate the sometimes challenging systems, to be able to know where is, the closest affordable daycare, where's the closest food pantry, so I can make sure I can save my money for rent and maybe not have to spend so much on food this month. That is so key. And again, that needs to be really tailored to that family's individual needs, making sure we're connecting them with rebuilding really that support system that broke down and led to them becoming homeless in the first place. So I think where we need to go from here has been mentioned, but to summarize it, let's use this opportunity. Let's ensure that everyone who we're helping now in non-congregate ways, non-congregate shelter ways, move from there into housing and not back into homelessness. Let's look at creating more of those kinds of units for single individuals that are small and very, very affordable. Zach talked about Section 8. That is essential. It's only going to get us so far. We need affordable units that don't require those kinds of vouchers as well. And then really just that long-term affordable housing, that move on. We just are in the midst of a collaboration with Housing Connect right now, where we're going to be able to move dozens of families who've been in our rapid rehousing program onto a Section 8 program, so that those families who don't really need that level of services anymore, but are in real danger of losing their housing when that short-term rental assistance runs up, are now going to be able to have a permanent voucher through Housing Connect. So thanks to them and their board for doing that in partnership with our agency. So permanent supportive housing, making sure that we have increase in preserving units and growing more basic affordable units, as well as really developing more permanent supportive housing and having innovative solutions, lots and lots of options, tailored, each very person-centered, because each individual and each family needs something a little bit different, and we have to be able to provide that to ensure that stability. So I'm just going to leave it there with that summary and turn it back over to you, Bill, in case there's any questions you want us to answer.
Okay. I think actually, yeah, we've had some questions from the audience, so we will try to respond to those in the comments section of the thing on Facebook. I think actually each of you has really added, has added to the options that state, county, local government officials could look at in terms of acting to reduce homelessness during this depression. I mean, you know, it makes a lot of sense why in 2009 we stopped investing in this type of targeted housing, because you're in a recession and it's hard to do. But as we discussed last week, state and local government, they own a lot of unused property, a lot of surplus property that could be put to this purpose. Some of it is located in locations that would be good for this type of thing. The state can issue bonds that they could be used for some of this purposes. And I mean, I think what I've heard people say is that we definitely need more housing for seniors who are at risk of becoming homeless. We need more really targeted housing for permanent supportive housing for families with kids. And I think when you look at the trauma that being homeless can have on children, getting that, you know, creating housing for the specific needs of those families is really important, because you run the risk of having generations of homeless kids. I mean, kids who are homeless, if their situation isn't stabilized, they end up becoming homeless parents. And so there is a real value in creating that supportive environment for families. I think Shawn's talk about, you know, making sure that people who get out of recovery actually have a place to live, people who get out of jail actually have a place to live. I think, you know, if we're to the extent that you know, that people relapse and return to jail at a higher rates when they don't have those things, I think there are big reasons why we could do that. But I think Michelle's big point that a lot of what we need, and I would bet that what Sahil was saying in terms of the people that they serve with diversion and rental assistance, I think we just need a lot more affordable units. When people are paying 70% of their income each month toward rent, like, they're much less likely to be homeless if they can get that down to 50%, let alone down to 30%, which experts say is the sort of the threshold for affordability. So I think there are all kinds of projects that state and local government could invest in and put people to work during a recession and help address our long-term needs. And I guess what I would say is, I mean, I know, like, I invited all four people hoping that three of them would be able to participate. And so I'm so grateful to each of the panelists for taking time to be part of this. I guess what I would say is that if you're on a city council or you're a county council member and you want ideas for things that could be done to help reduce homelessness in our community, I think any of these people would be happy to talk to you. We all are really passionate about reducing homelessness in Salt Lake County and in the state of Utah. So thank you all for participating. If you asked a question and you didn't get an answer, don't give up. Somebody will reply to you in the comment section on Facebook. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you, Bill.
Crossroads.